Today we're going to talk about conditional statements or if-then statements, okay? You'll hear me say either one. Conditional means you're saying a statement that's based on a condition. So if you do this, then I'll do this. So that's the reason it's called a conditional statement or if-then statement. All right, it's two parts of a conditional statement. You have hypothesis and conclusion. You share your handout. For hypothesis, the hypothesis is the P part of the conditional statement, and it's after the word if. Okay? Say that again. The hypothesis is the P part of a conditional statement, and it's after the word if. The conclusion is the Q part of the conditional statement following the word then. I'm going to say that again. The conclusion is the Q part of a conditional statement following the word then. So the reason I said P and Q, so those two things you're supposed to write down, so now listen to me for a second. Alright, so P and Q. The symbolic representation when we talk about conditional statements is a P, then the arrow, and then a Q. So it's pretty much representing if the hypothesis, then the conclusion. Okay? So that's what the P and Q are representing. So what we're going to do, clear this page, clear the ink. Okay. Alright, so now you should have a little foldable that we made in class. Okay, it's flips. Alright, and we did the little flaps already. So you're really just writing on the top part of each flap. Okay, you're writing on the top part of each flap. Alright, so I did an if-then statement. And we're going to do the converse, inverse, contrapositive of each one. And we already wrote those words down. And I'm going to define each one of them for you. So the statement we're going to use is, okay, on the very top flap, this is what I want you to write. If you give a mouse a cookie, then he will want some milk. Okay, if you give a mouse a cookie, then he will want some milk. Remember when we talked about false and true? Remember, if you can prove it false one time, it is a false statement. It doesn't matter if it's true 99.9% of the time. If it's 0.0% of the time false, it is false. So, even though this is a weird one to use, if you give a mouse a cookie, then he will want some milk, that would be a false statement. Because if you give a mouse a cookie, he might want some water. Some OJ. I don't know what mice want. So that's why I said this one was a little weird. But we'll just use it for right now. And so notice that we already wrote P, then Q on this one. Okay? Alright, now we're going to flip it. And we're going to open to the next one where you have converse. Converse. Okay, on this flap it was the converse. Notice on this one we wrote Q, then P. So on this one, the converse is when you exchange the hypothesis and conclusion. So that's why the Q and P switched places. So on this first example, the P would be that part, and then this part would be the Q. So if we were to flip that, if a mouse wants some milk, then you gave a mouse a cookie. So it switches places. Okay, so again, the converse was if a mouse wants some milk, then you gave a mouse a cookie. This is also a false statement. And in this statement, the hypothesis, which is this part, let's just say then you gave a mouse a cookie, it switched from up here. So notice it's Q, then P. Okay. The next one we have is the inverse. So you're going to flip it up again, and we're going to write on the inverse one. The inverse is when you negate or do the opposite of the hypothesis and conclusion. So again, for inverse, you negate or use the opposite of the hypothesis and conclusion. So the hypothesis and conclusion stay in the same direction. So notice on your little flap that we had already wrote not P, then not Q. Alright, so the reason I'm using the word negate is because if it's already negative, you will make it positive. But if it's positive, you make it negative. Notice in this one, both of the hypothesis and conclusion is positive, so we're going to make both of them negative. So our sentence would read, okay, so when we negate and use the inverse, we have, if you do not give a mouse a cookie, then he will not want milk. So notice the only difference between the inverse in the if then or conditional statement is the word not. Okay, so that's why we have not P, then not Q. Okay. Alright, then the last one we have is contrapositive. Contrapositive is when you negate and exchange the hypothesis and conclusion. So you negate and exchange the hypothesis and conclusion. Again, the contrapositive is when you negate and exchange the hypothesis and conclusion. So notice that it's not Q, then not P. Okay. So our same sentence from before. If you give a mouse a cookie, then he will want some milk. So if we negate it and exchange it, we would have. So if we negate and change the hypothesis and conclusion, it would say if a mouse does not want milk, then you did not give him a cookie. So notice that the Q is at the at the beginning, and the P is at the end, and they're both negated. So that's why it's written not Q, not P. Okay. Alright, so that's all that's going to be in on your foldable. You will have a little thing that I need you to fill out and practice figuring out what's your hypothesis and conclusion, and writing conditional statements in if-then form, and writing the converse, inverse, and contrapositive of any if-then statement. I did want to say something about writing a conditional statement in if-then form. So, for example, if you had a statement such as, okay, so for example, studying will make me able to pass the test. Now, if you look at this sentence, it is not in if-then form. It does not say if something, then something. It says studying will make me able to pass the test. So I want you to pause me for a second, and I want you to figure out how you would change that to if something, then something. Alright, so you could have done if I study, then I will pass the test. So that's how you change a regular sentence to a conditional statement. Okay. I want to also give you some ways to remember which one is which. We have I see. That's how some people remember. I see, you have the normal then you have the converse, inverse, and contrapositive. So then the I's go together, because remember this was P, then Q, and this one's not P, then not Q, and then the C's goes together. So Q, then P, then not Q, then not P. Okay? So you just have to figure out which ways help you remember. Another way, converse, you think of the shoe. You know how you can flip the tongue out on some converses? So converse is when you flip it. Inverse, it starts with an IN, so that's when you add is not. And contrapositive is like converse, okay, except negated. Okay, so you have to just figure out which way helps you remember which one is which.